think everybody should be encouraged to read your excellent report that's in everyone's seat. And I think what Sunny said characterizes some of the points of view you've expressed there, but perhaps you could put yourself in Conrad von Finkenstein's seat and tell us what you would do.
Well, I think that obviously things are moving in the right direction, as Michael says, to decide to not get in the way. I think the important point is that what they're proposing to do is extend existing non-discrimination standards to new media broadcasting undertakings. So essentially, I think what they're really saying is that they're agreeing with us, what we said all along really. It's the existing rules are actually quite usable under these circumstances. Don't regulate, get out of the way. I think Sunny's point about the holistic treatment is very important, because unfortunately it's fragmented into a number of different points. I'd also like to make some point of clarification that the upcoming CRTC hearings are actually not about net neutrality per se. It's a discussion very specifically about traffic management, and they are not the same thing. In fact, we have an interesting paradox, because you might argue if you wished to favour Canadian content over the internet, if in fact you could do that, that really becomes paradoxical because it's interfering with net neutrality. So.
Do any of our speakers have anything to say to what any of the other speakers have had to say?
Well, I do on the CanCom question. I actually don't think that Canadian content should have its own channel or attempt to find its own channel on the internet. I know there's been strong arguments for that to the CRTC. I think it's really about strengthening the capitalization of Canadian companies. We invest on a per project basis. We don't build bench strength in those companies so that they can sustain and build an economy. I think it's very much about the co-production environment. We've seen Canadian co-production drop dramatically over my engagement in the broadcast industry, and that's a lot because of the ways that regulation has operated. And I think it's very much about being able to look at a public space which can exist side by side with the private space within an internet environment. That's also strengthened. So I think there is a role for public broadcast, for example, that can help to support Canadian content that can jump across the public and the private domain. So. And I also think that we need to make sure that we free investment in digital media and new media from always being tied, with all due respect, to the broadcast chain. So I have a lot of concerns about...
Agree.
Okay, so, gaming industry, mobile content, social networking content, Canada lags behind in these spaces despite incredible producers because you always have to get a broadcast license.
Sure. Well, I think we're going to talk about net neutrality in a minute, so I'm not going to jump right into this issue. Is the CRTC net neutrality or looking at traffic management and the distinctions between the two? But what I would note is that yet another problem that the CRTC, I think, faced with respect to the statute was their attempt to carve out some of these net neutrality or traffic management issues from the new media discussion. And so the chair started off the very first day saying, that's not what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about it in July. And almost on a daily basis, people came before the CRTC throughout the hearings and wanted to talk about net neutrality. And so this notion that you can separate out these two, it comes up certainly in the context of whether or not ISPs get regulated, but it's a broader issue. It's a recognition that if you're talking about new media and the accessibility of new media, it's not enough just to talk about whether or not ISPs should be paying a fee or the CRTCs ought to get into some sort of licensing or regulatory function. It's to talk about how do people access this, how if at all, are the pipes either regulated or what sort of conditions do we set to ensure that everybody gets a fair chance.
Thank you. We have a regulator up in the audience who would like to say something, or a budding regulator perhaps.
Maybe I'm a budding regulator. Actually, I'm a budding please don't regulator. It seems to me that any regulatory structure that's going to be applied to anything on the internet needs to operate at the same scale as the internet. That would be my first comment. So it needs to be some kind of global body, or there's almost no point, because most stuff will happen outside your regulatory body if it is just Canada. The other thing I would say is that I saw a talk a couple of years ago actually by a PhD student as he was finishing his project, and it was basically saying the most efficient model for generating content is where you generate a pool of money from taxing some resource whose use scales with that content, so in this case maybe ISPs, produce a pool of money and then track the amount of views or the amount of engagement that content is getting amongst all of the people within Canada, and then allocate that money out to them proportionally. So basically you're sponsoring Canadian content proportional to its view on the internet from a tax that's applied to ISPs. Is that something that's being kind of considered? Because I know you do the same thing with like iPods, right?
Well, that's something we're gonna debate in a second. Would any of our session participants like to comment on that? Dave?
Well, it's being considered, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the problems that I have is that you've got a whole series of different constituencies, each who would look from funding in a similar fashion. And we were having a discussion last night, and when you start looking at the value chains and you look at the changes that are taking place, by the time I add up all the 25% that people are expecting, it soon becomes 300%. So the challenge we have is, I don't think you can keep taxing based on each of the special interest groups, because you can look after one group, but what about the others? You know, what about the starving studio architects? Somebody used to design recording studios. Should we recover their income, for instance? So it does become very complicated, and I really just don't see the idea of exerting a levy, because there are a lot of people who don't even engage in this, so you would end up with an awful lot of social foment, people who are taxed for things they don't even participate in.
We're going to turn to our panelists, but that gives us an opportunity to give some context to this from everybody. How many people feel an ISP tax is warranted and the proceeds of the tax should go to content producers? We've got a lot of abstainers.
It's encouraging. It's good. We have to hope.
Sonny?
You know, it's interesting how quickly we move to talking about a tax or a levy for redistribution. I always thought that we were trying to build this in more of a free market environment. And at the risk of sort of opening a can of worms here, one of the ways that you build a free market environment is you provide property rights. In the old days, somebody wanted to go and stake a claim out west here, mining for gold, and so they were given rights for the industry that they showed in coming out here and trying to look for gold, to settle the land, etc. It's not very different in the digital world. What you're talking about there, though, is copyright. And one could say that one way to fund the growth of new media and digital works is to have a copyright regime that actually works, that actually earns money for those producing content, who then have the rights that are protected by copyright. Of course, we all know that the regime is somewhat broken. It's based on a law that traditionally was I guess has gone back to 1710 in England. It's we had our first act almost 100 years ago in Canada. This thing needs to be updated in a big way. But ultimately, if you provide people with proper rights, then you allow the market to work, and then you really do see the best content go to the top. You can then subsidize new creations, etc., but you don't build a system with that's based on crutches.